Imagine for a moment, you're standing in the middle of a bustling city. Cars honk, people rush past, notifications ping endlessly on your phone. The noise is constant, the demands are endless, and your mind feels like a storm, swirling with worries, tasks, and endless what-ifs. And yet, somewhere deep within, there is a space untouched by all of this chaos. A quiet corner of your mind where nothing can disturb you, where the storms of stress and anxiety cannot reach. It's not far away. It's not hidden in some exotic temple or atop a distant mountain. It's already within you. And it is here that happiness quietly waits, not as a reward for achieving something, not as a prize for success, but simply as the natural outcome of a calm mind. Happiness, real happiness, isn't about chasing the latest trend, accumulating possessions, or earning accolades. Those things fade. They come and go like the seasons. True happiness, the kind that lingers, that feels steady and real, arises naturally when the mind finds calm. It's not something to grab or hold. It's something that emerges effortlessly when you stop resisting, when you stop fighting, and when you stop trying so hard to control everything. Throughout human history, the greatest teachers, philosophers, and spiritual guides have pointed to this truth. The Buddha, sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, realized that the mind is the source of all suffering and also the doorway to liberation. He discovered that when the mind settles, when it ceases its endless chatter and restlessness, a profound sense of peace and contentment naturally arises. It's a state that doesn't depend on circumstances, wealth, or recognition. It simply exists when the mind is still. But how do we reach this place of calm? How do we navigate the chaos of daily life and find that quiet center within ourselves? This journey begins with awareness. Awareness of the mind, of its patterns, and of the endless noise that pulls us in 100 different directions. It's a journey of noticing without judgment, of breathing through tension instead of resisting it, and of slowly letting go of the grip that fear, desire, and expectation have over us. Imagine, for a moment, what life could be like if this calm became your natural state. You wake up, not with dread or anxiety, but with a sense of ease. You face challenges without being swept away by them. You connect with others, not from a place of need or insecurity, but from presence and understanding. Every ordinary moment, drinking your morning coffee, walking down a crowded street, listening to a friend, becomes imbued with a quiet joy, a subtle, steady contentment that doesn't demand anything in return. And here's the fascinating part. This calm doesn't require you to change the world outside. It doesn't require solving every problem or achieving every goal. All it asks is that you turn inward, even for a few moments, and allow your mind to settle. The ripples of this inner calm spread outward, transforming your experience of life in ways that are subtle yet profound. The smile of a stranger, the warmth of the sun, the sound of a bird, these simple things take on a depth and clarity that might have been invisible before. The journey we are about to explore together isn't about following rigid rules or performing some complex ritual. It's about discovering through experience that happiness is already present. It's not hidden, it's not distant. It's waiting for the mind to find stillness. And once you do, life begins to unfold with a sense of effortless joy, a quiet satisfaction that doesn't need to be explained or justified. So, let us begin here, at this calm center. Let us explore the nature of the mind, understand the illusions that often lead us astray, and discover the simple yet profound practices that allow peace and happiness to arise naturally. The storm outside may rage, the world may demand and distract, but within there is a space that is untouched, a space where your mind can rest, and in that rest where happiness quietly blooms. Take a breath, feel the present moment, and know that even now, as you listen, happiness is quietly waiting for your mind to be still. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine your mind as a vast, restless ocean. Waves rise and fall, sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent. Thoughts, worries, memories, and desires surge like tides that never sleep. This is the nature of the mind, constantly in motion, endlessly reacting, always searching for something outside itself to feel whole or secure. Most of us live in this turbulence without even realizing it. We mistake the constant chatter for reality. The inner critic whispers, "You're not enough," or "You need this, you need that," and we follow blindly as if happiness depends on doing, achieving, or acquiring. And the truth, that chatter rarely leads to peace. It keeps the mind trapped, caught in a loop of desire and aversion, hope and disappointment. In Buddhism, the mind is often described as a mirror. But unlike a perfectly polished mirror, our minds are smudged, clouded by distraction, fear, and attachment. When the mirror is covered in grime, it cannot reflect clearly. When the mind is restless, reality is distorted. We perceive life through layers of anxiety, craving, and unresolved emotions. This distorted perception creates suffering, even in moments that could be simple and joyful. Consider a moment of anger or frustration. The situation itself may be minor, a comment, a delayed appointment, a minor inconvenience, but the mind magnifies it. Thoughts race. Why is this happening? This is unfair. I can't handle this. Suddenly, the storm inside seems far larger than the storm outside. This is the mind reacting automatically, habitually, without conscious awareness. Yet the mind is not inherently our enemy. It is like a powerful river. Uncontrolled, it can sweep us away. Harnessed, it can nourish and sustain life. The key lies in understanding its patterns. The mind tends toward three habitual reactions: grasping, aversion, and distraction. We grasp what we desire, push away what we fear, and constantly chase something new to fill the emptiness. Each of these reactions creates turbulence, keeping calmness and contentment just out of reach. The wisdom of the ancients is simple yet profound. Notice these patterns. Observe your thoughts as they rise and fall. Don't judge, don't fight, don't try to force them away. Imagine watching clouds drift across the sky. Some are dark and heavy, some light and wispy. You don't grab the clouds or push them away, you simply watch them pass. In the same way, the mind can be observed. With practice, the intensity of the waves begins to soften. The turbulence doesn't vanish immediately, but it no longer controls you. This understanding is the first step toward true calm. When we recognize the nature of the mind, its restlessness, its patterns, its habitual reactions, we gain freedom. Freedom from being dragged by every thought, every fear, every fleeting desire. The mind starts to open to something deeper. The natural clarity and calm that has always been there beneath the surface. Think about the times when you felt completely absorbed in a moment, watching a sunset, listening to music, or simply breathing deeply. In these moments, the mind is quiet, even if briefly. There's a sense of clarity, of spaciousness, of freedom from the usual storm. That is the mind in its natural state, calm and receptive. And here's the remarkable truth. That state is not rare or reserved for a select few. It is available to everyone the moment the mind learns to settle. But settling the mind is not about suppressing thoughts or emotions. It is about understanding their nature, seeing them clearly, and learning to let them flow without resistance. It is a gradual process, like training a wild horse: patience, awareness, and gentle guidance. And as this calm grows, something extraordinary happens. Happiness begins to emerge, not as a reward, not as something to chase, but as a natural result of clarity and peace within. So, if the mind is like an ocean, consider the possibility of still waters beneath the surface. No matter how rough the waves appear, beneath them lies calm, depth, and serenity. This is what we are seeking, not to escape life's currents, but to discover the calm that always exists, waiting quietly for us to notice it. As we continue, we'll explore why so many of us mistake external things for happiness, and how this misunderstanding keeps us trapped in endless cycles of desire. Only by seeing the mind clearly can we begin to experience joy that is steady, lasting, and independent of circumstance. Take a moment now. Feel the rise and fall of your thoughts without judgment. Notice the space between them, the quiet undercurrent that has always been there. That quiet is your gateway to happiness, patiently waiting as you learn to see the mind for what it truly is. Have you ever chased something you thought would make you happy, only to find that the feeling faded almost as soon as it arrived? A promotion, a new gadget, a compliment, a vacation, each one promising joy, only to leave you searching for the next thing. This is the illusion of external happiness. From the moment we are born, society teaches us to look outward for fulfillment. You'll be happy when you achieve this, when you acquire that, when someone notices you. We chase, we strive, and we achieve. But the happiness we seek never seems to last. It's like trying to capture sunlight in your hands, bright and warm for a moment, but always slipping away. Buddhism calls this the nature of samsara, the cycle of craving and dissatisfaction. We mistake temporary pleasures for lasting contentment. The more we cling to what is impermanent, the more we set ourselves up for disappointment. Every success or possession can only bring happiness so long as we hold it. And when it changes or disappears, the fleeting joy vanishes as well. Consider this: you've worked tirelessly for a promotion. When it finally comes, you feel elated. But within weeks, the excitement fades and new pressures, responsibilities, or comparisons arise. The happiness you sought externally cannot sustain itself because it was never rooted in your inner landscape. It was dependent on circumstances, and circumstances are always changing. This isn't to say that external achievements or possessions are meaningless. They can bring convenience, comfort, and even inspiration. But relying on them as the primary source of joy is a trap. It's a trap we fall into daily, comparing ourselves to others on social media, measuring worth by income, status, or recognition. The mind clings to what is fleeting and overlooks what is ever present, its own natural capacity for peace. Imagine the irony. The more we seek happiness outside, the more restless our minds become. Every external gain is accompanied by a new desire, a new comparison, a new worry. The cycle spins faster, leaving little room for calm. And yet, happiness is not actually somewhere out there. It is waiting quietly within, as simple and accessible as a breath, as natural as a heartbeat. Stories from those who have walked this path illustrate the truth vividly. A wealthy merchant once pursued riches endlessly, thinking that money would finally fill the emptiness inside. Yet despite all he acquired, he remained restless, unsatisfied, haunted by anxiety. Only when he paused, turned inward, and began observing his own mind, did he taste the calm joy that no wealth could provide. This is the essence of the teaching. External things can never substitute for inner stillness. Science, too, confirms what the sages have known for millennia. Studies on happiness show that material gains only produce short-term spikes of pleasure, whereas practices like meditation, mindfulness, and gratitude cultivate lasting well-being. When we train the mind to settle, to appreciate the present, and to let go of endless craving, happiness arises naturally, without effort, without dependence, without the roller coaster of external circumstances. So how do we shift our perspective? How do we stop seeking joy outside and begin discovering it within? The first step is awareness. Notice when your mind chases external rewards. Observe the subtle dissatisfaction that lingers even when you get what you think you want. Then turn your attention inward. Breathe. Observe your thoughts, your emotions, the rhythm of your being. In this simple act of noticing, the illusion begins to dissolve. Happiness in its truest form is not something to earn or collect. It is a state of being, a quality that naturally emerges when the mind is calm and uncluttered by endless desires. By recognizing the impermanence of external things, we free ourselves from the trap of chasing shadows and start cultivating the timeless joy that resides in stillness. Picture this: a quiet morning, sunlight spilling across the room, a cup of tea in your hands. No grand achievement, no applause, no notifications, just presence, just calm. And in that presence, a subtle, effortless happiness arises. It was never missing. It was never elsewhere. It was simply waiting for your mind to notice. Now, as we begin to understand the limitations of seeking happiness externally, the path forward becomes clearer. The mind itself holds the key, And through simple practices, we can begin to cultivate calm, focus, and peace. These are the tools that allow happiness to arise naturally, effortlessly, like a flower blooming in the sun, without chasing it, without forcing it, just letting it be. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, the world outside fading into a distant hum. Your mind, which moments ago raced with endless thoughts, begins to slow. With each breath, a sense of ease settles over you. This is the doorway to calm, the practice of meditation. Meditation is not about escaping life. It is not about silencing every thought or achieving some mystical state overnight. It is, at its core, a simple yet profound way to observe the mind, to meet its restlessness with patience, and to gently return to stillness. Through meditation, we learn that the mind does not have to be our master. It can become our ally, our source of clarity, and our companion on the journey toward happiness. Consider the mind as a pond. When disturbed, the water is murky, reflecting only distorted images. But when left undisturbed, the water clears naturally, and the reflections become sharp, truthful, serene. Meditation is the act of letting the waters of the mind settle. Each mindful breath, each moment of attentive presence calms the turbulence, revealing the clarity and calm that has always been there beneath the surface. Let me tell you a story. There was a young professional always racing against the clock, anxious about work, relationships, and the future. Stress consumed every waking moment. One day, introduced to meditation, he felt skeptical. How could simply sitting quietly help him? Yet day by day, with a few minutes of focused breathing and mindful observation, he noticed something remarkable. His thoughts lost their grip. The endless mental chatter began to quiet. Small frustrations no longer triggered storms of anxiety. Gradually, a sense of inner peace emerged, not forced, not earned, just present. Meditation works because it reconnects us with the natural rhythm of being. It trains the mind to notice without reacting, to observe without clinging. When a thought arises, instead of getting swept away by it, you acknowledge it. There is worry, there is desire, there is fear. And then you return gently to the anchor of the present moment, your breath, your body, your awareness. Over time, this simple practice rewires the mind, creating space between thought and reaction. Calm becomes the default state, and happiness begins to emerge naturally from that stillness. Science, too, validates what the sages have known for centuries. Research shows that meditation reduces stress hormones, increases emotional resilience, and strengthens the brain regions associated with attention and compassion. In other words, when we cultivate calm through meditation, we are literally reshaping our minds to experience more peace and joy, independent of circumstances. And the beauty of it is this: meditation is accessible to everyone. You don't need a fancy cushion, a serene temple, or hours of free time. Even 5 minutes a day just sitting quietly, observing your breath and noticing your thoughts begins the process. The mind learns that it can rest. The heart learns that it can be still. And in that stillness, happiness rises, not as a reward, not as a goal, but as a natural consequence of inner calm. Think about the simplest moments. Inhaling and exhaling, the feeling of air entering your lungs, the subtle sensations in your body. When we anchor attention here, the noise of worry fades. When practiced consistently, meditation reveals a profound truth. Happiness does not have to be sought. It is already present when the mind is at peace. So, as we explore this practice together, remember, meditation is not a task, it is an invitation. An invitation to slow down, to observe, to feel, and to awaken to the calm that has always been waiting. Every breath is a reminder that you can return to this inner sanctuary, no matter how chaotic the world outside may be. Take a moment now. Close your eyes, breathe, and simply notice the quiet within. The calm is yours, waiting patiently. And from this calm, happiness will emerge effortlessly, naturally, and enduringly. Meditation is powerful, but true calm doesn't live only in quiet rooms or on meditation cushions. Real peace shows up in the ordinary moments of life, the ones we often overlook. Washing dishes, walking to work, sipping tea, listening to a friend. These moments, when approached mindfully, become gateways to a calm and joyful mind. Mindfulness is the art of fully inhabiting the present. It's not about escaping reality or blocking out thoughts. It's about noticing, with curiosity and clarity, whatever is happening right now. The breath, the body, the sounds around you, the thoughts that arise, all are observed without judgment. In this simple awareness, the mind begins to settle, and happiness, quiet yet profound, arises naturally. Let me share a story. A young teacher, overwhelmed with responsibilities, constantly felt stressed. One day she decided to try mindfulness, not by sitting on a cushion, but by paying full attention to the mundane tasks she usually rushed through. She noticed the warmth of the water as she washed dishes, the rhythm of her steps on the sidewalk, the subtle taste of her lunch. Something remarkable happened. The stress that usually weighed on her began to lift. Each simple moment became rich with presence, and with presence came joy. This is the magic of mindfulness in daily life. It transforms ordinary experiences into opportunities for calm and happiness. Washing dishes is no longer a chore. It is a meditation. Walking to work is no longer a blur of thoughts. It is a dance of awareness. Even a crowded, noisy commute can become a practice of observing without reaction. The key is to bring attention to the present moment, to notice without judgment, and to allow the mind to rest in awareness. Buddhism teaches that the mind often wanders because we resist what is happening or cling to what we wish were different. Mindfulness dissolves that resistance. By observing life as it is without chasing or avoiding, we stop fueling the turbulence of the mind. The simple act of noticing, fully and kindly, allows peace to grow naturally. Science supports this as well. Studies show that practicing mindfulness in daily activities reduces stress, improves focus, and enhances emotional well-being. The brain itself begins to rewire, strengthening pathways that support calm, resilience, and even compassion. What was once an automatic reaction, irritation at a delayed bus, frustration over a spilled coffee, can now be met with awareness, a pause, and gentle acceptance. Imagine this: you're walking through a busy street. Instead of rushing, lost in thought or worries, you notice the sway of the trees, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the subtle rhythm of your own steps. You are fully present. The noise around you is still there, but it no longer controls you. And in that presence, happiness arises, not forced, not sought after, but simply emerging from a mind that is fully alive to the moment. Mindfulness is not complicated. It doesn't require perfection, long hours, or special techniques. It is simply the intention to notice life as it is again and again. A deep breath before responding to frustration. Pausing to observe your sensations while drinking tea. Listening fully to another person without planning your reply. These small acts, repeated daily, build a foundation of calm that underpins lasting happiness. The beauty of mindfulness is that it bridges meditation and life. What we cultivate on the cushion, the calm, the awareness, the gentle attention, can be carried into every interaction, every activity, every moment. Life itself becomes the meditation. And when the mind rests in this ongoing awareness, happiness is no longer fleeting. It is woven into the fabric of existence, quietly, naturally, effortlessly. Take a moment now. Notice the sensations of your body, the rhythm of your breath, the sounds around you. Even in this small awareness, you are practicing mindfulness. And in that practice, the calm of your mind opens the door to happiness. A happiness that does not chase, does not cling, but simply arises when the mind is fully present. Have you ever noticed how much energy we spend resisting our emotions? Anger, sadness, fear, even jealousy. These feelings arise naturally, yet we often try to push them away, hide them, or numb them. And in that resistance, the mind becomes restless, the heart heavy, and happiness drifts further out of reach. Buddhism teaches a different approach. Face your emotions directly but without resistance. Notice them as they arise, acknowledge them without judgment, and let them flow. Emotions, like waves, come and go. They are not permanent and they are not you. When we stop fighting them, we discover a profound truth. The mind can remain calm even amid strong feelings. Let me share a story. A man burdened by grief after losing a loved one tried to suppress his sorrow. He immersed himself in work, distracted himself with tasks, hoping the sadness would fade. But the more he resisted, the more intense the grief became. One day, guided by mindfulness, he simply allowed himself to feel the sorrow fully. He noticed it in his chest, in his throat, in the tightness of his body. He breathed into it, observed it, and gradually the storm of emotion began to soften. What he discovered was unexpected. In acknowledging his pain, he found a subtle, steady calm, a space where happiness could quietly return. Emotions are not enemies to be conquered. They are signals, teachers, and reminders of our humanity. Anger tells us when boundaries are crossed, fear alerts us to potential danger, sadness opens the heart to compassion and understanding. By resisting, we block the lessons they offer and prolong our suffering. By facing them with awareness, we cultivate resilience, clarity, and even joy. Mindfulness gives us the tools to navigate emotional waves. When a strong emotion arises, pause, notice it, name it silently. This is anger, or this is fear. Observe how it manifests in your body, how it shifts and changes. You don't need to analyze it or act on it. You simply allow it to exist. And when the mind is no longer resisting, the emotional energy flows naturally, dissipates, and leaves behind clarity and calm. Science supports this approach. Studies in psychology show that emotional acceptance, acknowledging feelings rather than suppressing them, reduces stress, enhances emotional intelligence, and improves overall well-being. Our brains are designed to process emotions, but when we resist, we create tension and turbulence. When we allow, observe, and release, the natural calm of the mind emerges. Imagine a stormy sky. Dark clouds gather, lightning flashes, rain pours. If you try to stop the storm, you only struggle against forces beyond your control. But if you observe the storm, note its patterns, and let it run its course, the sky eventually clears. Emotions work in much the same way. Resistance only intensifies them. Acceptance allows them to pass, leaving a calm, open sky in the mind. This doesn't mean emotions become easy or painless. Some waves are strong, some storms last longer than we wish. But with practice, the mind learns that it can be stable even in the midst of turbulence. Happiness does not require the absence of emotion. It arises naturally when the mind stops fighting against the flow of life. So, next time anger rises, or sadness lingers, or fear grips your heart, pause, breathe, observe, allow it to be. You may discover, as countless practitioners have before you, that in the very act of facing emotions without resistance, a subtle peace begins to bloom. A happiness that does not depend on circumstances, a joy that is steady, natural, and enduring. Take a moment now. Notice any emotion present without judgment, without pushing it away. Simply observe, and in this simple act, your mind begins to settle. Your heart begins to open. And in that stillness, happiness quietly arises. Have you ever noticed how much suffering comes from clinging? Clinging to people, to outcomes, to possessions, to ideas of who we think we should be. Attachment and the expectations we place on life often create more turbulence than life itself. We believe that if we hold tightly enough, we can secure happiness. But the truth is, the tighter we grip, the more we feel life slipping through our fingers. Buddhism teaches a profound principle. Suffering arises from attachment and expectation. When we grasp at what is impermanent, we set ourselves up for disappointment. When we demand that life conforms to our desires, we live in a constant state of tension. Letting go does not mean indifference or passivity. It means releasing the need to control, the compulsion to dictate outcomes, and the endless striving that blocks inner peace. Let me tell you a story. A young artist worked tirelessly on her painting, pouring her heart and soul into every brushstroke. She hoped for recognition, praise, even fame. When the gallery rejected her work, she felt crushed, defeated. Yet when she learned to release her expectations, releasing the attachment to approval, she discovered something extraordinary. She painted not for recognition, not for reward, but for the joy of creation itself. And in this act of letting go, a quiet happiness emerged, deeper and more enduring than any external accolade could provide. Attachment often comes in disguise. We cling to relationships, thinking that our happiness depends on someone else. We cling to jobs, believing success will fill a void. We cling to ideals, believing life must unfold in a certain way. But life is impermanent, ever-changing, unpredictable. When we recognize the fleeting nature of all things, the mind begins to release its grip. Space opens up for calm, for clarity, for a happiness that is independent of circumstance. Expectations are like heavy chains around the mind. This should happen, that must happen, life must be fair. The tighter we hold onto these ideas, the more suffering arises when reality diverges from our imagined path. Letting go is not giving up. It is allowing life to flow naturally. It is embracing what is, rather than resisting what cannot be controlled. In that acceptance, freedom arises. Practically, letting go begins with awareness. Notice where you are clinging. Observe the subtle tension in your body, the tightness in your mind when things do not go as planned. Breathe and gently release. Allow life to unfold without forcing or demanding, and notice the surprising effect. As the grip loosens, the mind settles, the heart softens. Happiness, which seemed dependent on outcomes, begins to bloom effortlessly from within. Science, too, has observed the benefits of releasing attachment. Studies show that reducing fixation on outcomes and cultivating acceptance decreases stress, enhances emotional well-being, and fosters resilience. When we let go, we reduce the mental friction that blocks calm. The mind experiences a sense of spaciousness, and in that space, happiness can arise naturally, like sunlight filtering through the clouds. Picture a bird perched on a branch. If it clings too tightly, it struggles and cannot fly freely. But if it allows itself to rest lightly, with openness, it can soar. Our minds, too, can soar when we release attachment and expectation. Freedom is not found in holding on, it is found in letting go. And in that freedom, happiness is no longer fleeting or conditional. It is steady, profound, and ever-present. So, pause for a moment. Consider what you may be holding too tightly: expectations, desires, attachments. Breathe and imagine gently releasing them. Feel the tension dissolve. Notice the space that emerges in your mind. And in that space, recognize the quiet joy that has been waiting all along. A happiness that does not cling, does not demand, and yet shines effortlessly. This is the art of letting go. A simple, profound practice that transforms the way we experience life. By releasing attachment and expectation, the mind finds calm, and happiness arises naturally, not as a distant goal, but as a living, breathing presence within. For centuries, spiritual traditions have emphasized the power of a calm mind. But now, modern science is catching up, revealing what the sages have known all along. A settled mind is not just a poetic ideal, it is a neurological reality. Consider this. When the mind is restless, anxious, or overwhelmed, the brain is flooded with stress hormones like cortisol. Heart rates spike, muscles tense, and the body operates in a state of heightened alert, as if constantly bracing for danger. Over time, this chronic stress damages physical and mental health, creating a cycle of tension, worry, and unhappiness. But when we cultivate calm through meditation, mindfulness, or simply mindful breathing, the brain begins to change. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, allows us to form new patterns of thought. Studies show that regular meditation reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear and stress center, while increasing connectivity in regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and empathy. In simple terms, a calm mind is literally a healthier, happier mind. Let me tell you a story. A young executive, overwhelmed by the demands of his job, began practicing mindfulness for just 10 minutes each morning. Within weeks, he noticed a remarkable difference. Tasks that once felt stressful became manageable. Conversations that used to trigger irritation now flowed with patience. And most importantly, he felt a steady sense of well-being that wasn't dependent on external outcomes. Science explains this. His brain was physically adapting to calm, reshaping itself to respond with clarity rather than reactivity. The benefits extend beyond the brain. Research shows that a calm mind improves sleep, strengthens the immune system, and even enhances decision-making. Emotional resilience increases, meaning we respond to challenges with wisdom rather than knee-jerk reactions. Relationships deepen as we listen and engage more fully. In essence, cultivating a calm mind creates a ripple effect, transforming our experience of life at every level. But here's the truly fascinating part. These scientific findings align perfectly with ancient Buddhist wisdom. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from a restless, clinging mind, and that liberation comes through awareness, mindfulness, and inner calm. Now, neuroscience confirms that calming the mind is not merely philosophical. It has measurable, tangible effects on our bodies and our lives. Practicing calm doesn't require hours of meditation or retreating to a monastery. Even small, consistent practices, focusing on the breath for a few minutes, observing thoughts without judgment, or grounding attention in the present, can rewire the brain. Over time, calm becomes the default state, and happiness arises naturally from that inner stability. Imagine standing at the edge of a lake early in the morning. The water is perfectly still, reflecting the sky above with absolute clarity. This stillness mirrors the brain and mind in a calm state, clear, receptive, and balanced. Now imagine that same lake in a storm, waves crashing, wind howling. The reflection is distorted, chaotic, even frightening. Meditation and mindfulness act like a gentle, windless morning, allowing the waters of the mind to settle, revealing the clarity and beauty that has always been there. Science and spirituality converge in this truth. Happiness is not found in chasing external circumstances, but in cultivating calm within. When the mind settles, clarity emerges, awareness deepens, emotional turbulence diminishes, and in this space joy arises not as a fleeting spike but as a steady, natural presence. So take a moment now. Close your eyes, notice your breath. Imagine the waters of your mind beginning to settle. Even in this brief pause, your brain is changing, your mind is calming, and a subtle happiness begins to emerge, naturally, effortlessly, and enduringly. The science is clear. A calm mind is not a luxury. It is the foundation for a meaningful, joyful, and resilient life. And the best part, you don't need permission, you don't need resources, and you don't need to wait. Calm is available right now, waiting quietly, ready to transform your life. Happiness is often imagined as something extraordinary, a monumental achievement, a grand celebration, a life-changing event. Yet in truth, joy is rarely found in extremes. It is hidden in the quiet moments, the simple details, the unnoticed gifts that surround us every day. Practicing everyday joy is the art of noticing these small treasures, of allowing happiness to arise naturally from the present moment. Consider the warmth of sunlight streaming through a window, the aroma of freshly brewed tea, the laughter of a friend, or the gentle rhythm of your own breath. These are ordinary moments, and yet they carry the profound capacity to awaken joy when observed with awareness. Mindfulness transforms these experiences from mundane to extraordinary, not by changing the moment, but by changing how we meet it. Let me share a story. A busy mother, caught in the endless cycle of work, errands, and family obligations, felt perpetually exhausted and unfulfilled. One day, she decided to consciously notice small pleasures, a child's smile, the scent of flowers in her garden, the taste of her morning coffee. Over time, these tiny acts of attention began to accumulate, creating a quiet, persistent sense of happiness. She discovered that joy was never missing. It had simply been overlooked amidst the rush of life. This practice does not require perfection or grand gestures. It begins with awareness. pausing to notice the world, noticing the sensations of the body, the beauty in small moments, the subtle feelings of gratitude that naturally arise. As we cultivate this habit, our minds shift from chasing happiness to receiving it, from demanding joy to noticing it. The difference is profound. Science supports this approach as well. Research in positive psychology shows that simple practices, gratitude journaling, mindful observation, savoring small moments, significantly enhance well-being, reduce stress, and improve resilience. These practices train the mind to focus on what is present and meaningful, rather than dwelling on what is lacking. In other words, joy becomes a natural outcome of attention, not a distant goal to chase. Everyday joy also thrives in connection. A smile exchanged with a stranger, a kind word to a colleague, a moment of shared laughter. These interactions enrich both giver and receiver. Happiness grows when it is shared, and even the simplest acts of compassion can cultivate a deep, steady sense of well-being. Imagine waking each morning with this intention: to notice, to savor, to participate fully in the ordinary miracles around you. The aroma of breakfast, the sunlight on your skin, the sound of birds, each becomes a seed of joy. Each breath, each glance, each smile is a doorway to presence, calm, and contentment. Over time, these seeds grow into a garden of happiness that does not depend on external conditions, a joy that is constant, gentle, and enduring. Practicing everyday joy does not eliminate challenges, stress, or grief. Life remains unpredictable and emotions continue to arise. But when the mind is calm, mindful, and open, even difficulties can be experienced with clarity, acceptance, and the subtle presence of contentment. Happiness, then, is not the absence of hardship. It is the natural companion of a mind that has learned to rest, observe, and appreciate. So, take a moment now. Look around you. Notice the small details, the colors, the sounds, the textures, the sensations. Breathe in fully. Recognize the subtle beauty that exists here and now. And in that simple noticing, let a quiet joy bloom within you. This is the practice of everyday happiness, a practice that is simple, profound, and transformative. Joy is not somewhere far away, waiting for the right moment. It is already here, already present, waiting for your attention. And when you cultivate it every day, happiness ceases to be a fleeting visitor and becomes a steady, natural presence in your life. As we arrive at the end of this journey, take a moment to pause and breathe. Reflect on what we have explored, the restless nature of the mind, the illusions of chasing happiness outside ourselves, the transformative power of meditation, mindfulness, emotional awareness, letting go of attachment, and the simple yet profound practice of noticing everyday joy. Through it all, one truth remains clear. Happiness is not a distant destination, and calm is not a rare state reserved for extraordinary circumstances. Calm and joy are always available, quietly waiting within the mind, waiting for us to notice, to settle, to allow. They are not earned, not forced, and not dependent on life unfolding perfectly. They are natural outcomes of a mind that is aware, present, and gentle with itself. Consider the mind as a vast sky. Storms come and go, thoughts, emotions, challenges, and distractions. Yet the sky itself remains vast, open, and untouched by the passing clouds. This is the nature of the calm within, enduring, spacious, and free. Meditation, mindfulness, awareness of emotions, letting go of attachment. These practices are the tools that allow us to see the sky clearly, to recognize the stillness that has always been there beneath the turbulence. The beauty of this realization is that it transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. A simple breath, a quiet walk, a shared smile. These moments become vessels of happiness when experienced with awareness. Life, in its entirety, becomes a practice. Not a practice in the sense of striving or achieving, but a practice in the sense of noticing, allowing, and embracing the present with clarity and kindness. The calm that lasts is not dependent on circumstances. It does not fade when challenges arise. It is resilient, steady, and deep-rooted. And it is within your reach at every moment, through conscious awareness and gentle practice. Every breath, every pause, every mindful observation is an opportunity to return to this natural state. So, as you step back into the world beyond this moment, carry this understanding with you. Let the mind rest in stillness when it can, return to awareness when it wanders, and greet each moment with curiosity and openness. The small practices, repeated daily, create ripples that transform the entire experience of life. Happiness is not something to chase. Calm is not something to seek. They arise effortlessly when the mind is present, when the heart is open, and when we allow life to be as it is. This is the timeless truth. The calm within is your companion, the joy within your constant friend, patiently waiting, ever present, and endlessly available. Take a deep breath now. Feel the calm that is already here. Let it fill you, steady you, and remind you that peace and happiness are not in the future. They are in this moment, in this breath, and in the simple, quiet awareness that you carry with you always. And with that, may your mind remain calm, your heart open, and your life imbued with the quiet, enduring happiness that naturally arises from within. If this message resonated with you, if the calm within spoke to something deep in your heart, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism, wisdom, and journey with us into the timeless teachings of the Buddha, discovering clarity, peace, and joy in each moment. Share this video with someone who might need a quiet pause today and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts or experiences. Your presence here is part of the practice, the gentle ripple that spreads understanding and calm. And remember, the calm, the joy, and the wisdom we seek are always within reach. Take a breath, notice the stillness, and carry it with you as you move through your day.